The morning started out peacefully, the kind of calm that made you forget about the world's problems, if only for a while. I was sitting on my front porch, a steaming cup of coffee in hand, soaking in the crisp morning air. My golden retriever, Max, lay sprawled beside me, his head resting on his paws as he lazily blinked up at the sky. Birds flitted between trees, and a gentle breeze rustled the leaves. For once, everything felt easy. Max, sensing my relaxed mood, gave a soft huff, his tail thumping lazily against the wooden porch. He wasn't much of a barker, unless the mailman walked a little too close, or the neighbor's cat dared to strut across our lawn. But even then, his outbursts were brief. He'd give a bark or two, maybe spin in a circle, then retreat back to his usual routine of napping, chasing squirrels, and accepting belly rubs. I took another sip of coffee, savoring the warmth. But as I reached for my morning mail, I felt that calm start to unravel. Sitting right on top of the stack was a crisp white envelope, bearing the dreaded HOA logo. My stomach knotted. HOA letters never meant good news. Maybe a notice about garbage bins being left out too long, or a reminder about lawn maintenance. But this envelope felt heavier, like bad news sealed inside. I tore it open, and unfolded the letter. Violation notice. Dear homeowner, we have received multiple complaints regarding your dog's persistent barking, and your backyard fence, which is in violation of neighborhood aesthetic standards. You are hereby fined $500 for these violations. Failure to pay within 14 days may result in further disciplinary action. I stared at the page in disbelief. Persistent barking. Max barely made a sound unless something startled him. And my fence. It had stood there, unchanged for years. I read the letter again, hoping I'd misunderstood. But no, there it was, clear as day. Max was suddenly a nuisance, and my fence, the same one I'd carefully stained and maintained since moving in, was now considered non-compliant. Max lifted his head, sensing my irritation. Looks like you're a criminal now, I muttered, scratching behind his ears. His tail wagged, oblivious to the drama unfolding. Frustration simmered beneath my skin, but I tried to keep calm. Maybe this was just a misunderstanding, a clerical error, or some overzealous neighbor with too much time on their hands. After all, I'd lived in this neighborhood for over a decade. I knew most of my neighbors well enough to believe no one had a serious issue with Max. But deep down, I had a sinking feeling I already knew who was behind this. Karen. She had been crowned HOA president just a few months earlier, and the neighborhood had changed almost instantly. Suddenly people were getting fined for things no one had cared about before. Mailboxes that weren't painted neutral enough, potted plants that didn't meet her undefined aesthetic standards, and even kids playing too loudly in their own yards. Karen's self-declared authority spread like wildfire, and now, apparently, Max and I were her latest targets. I wasn't about to let this slide. That afternoon, I headed to the HOA office to clear things up. The building was a dull beige box with glass doors that always seemed to stick no matter how hard you pushed. Inside, Karen sat behind the counter, tapping her pen against a clipboard. Her expression was smug, the kind of smile that said she already knew why I was there. Afternoon, I said, forcing a tight smile. I'm here about this. I slid the letter across the counter. Karen didn't even look at it. Ah, yes, she said, folding her hands neatly on the desk. I figured you'd be stopping by. You figured right, I shot back. This has to be a mistake. Max doesn't bark like that, and my fence has been there for years without issue. Her smile widened, sharp and predatory. Well, she drawled, we've had several complaints, and rules are rules. Noise disturbances are a serious issue. As for your fence, it's a visual eyesore, doesn't match the neighborhood's refined look. I stared at her in disbelief. Visual eyesore, I repeated. It's a wooden fence like half the houses on the street. It's too high, she said coolly. It's within code, I snapped back. Karen tilted her head, savoring the confrontation like it was her morning cup of coffee. Well, she said sweetly, you're welcome to review the HOA regulations, but unless you have proof that you're compliant, the fine stands. I clenched my jaw. Proof. Oh, I had proof. More than she could imagine. That night, I went digging. My home office was cluttered. Old papers, receipts and warranty forms packed into file folders that hadn't seen daylight in years. But tucked beneath the mess was exactly what I needed. The original HOA charter. Back when the neighborhood was still developing, I had been part of the founding committee that created the HOA rules. I hadn't thought much about it since. The rules were basic back then: lawn care expectations, noise curfews, and simple guidelines to keep the neighborhood looking tidy. Nothing outrageous, certainly nothing like Karen's reign of petty fines and power trips. Flipping through the pages, I found the key sections. The noise regulation clearly stated that a dog's barking was only considered a disturbance if it continued for 30 minutes or more without pause. Max's occasional woof at a passing jogger or curious squirrel didn't come close. And the fence? Even better. The maximum height for backyard fencing was 6 feet. My fence? Exactly 6 feet. I couldn't help but grin. Karen hadn't just bent the rules, she'd tried to rewrite them entirely. And now, I had the original document in my hands to prove it. The next HOA meeting couldn't come soon enough. When I walked into the community center that evening, the room was already buzzing with whispers. Karen stood at the front, clipboard in hand, her eyes scanning the crowd like a queen surveying her subjects. When my turn to speak came, I walked up to the podium with the HOA charter in hand. Karen's smug expression faltered just slightly. "I'm here to dispute my violation," I announced, holding up her letter. "Because according to the actual rules, I'm not in violation of anything." I read the exact section about dog noise, explaining how Max's brief barking didn't even come close to meeting the criteria. Then I turned to the page on fencing, pointing directly to the height limit, one that I, as one of the original rule creators, had written myself. Karen's face twisted in frustration, her smug grin now replaced with forced neutrality. "Well," she stammered, "policies can evolve, and we've updated some of the rules since then." "Not without a neighborhood vote," I shot back, flipping to the section that confirmed all changes required a 2/3 majority. "And unless you've been holding secret meetings, I doubt that's happened." The room erupted in whispers, and Karen's face flushed red. She opened her mouth to argue, but the crowd had already turned on her. Neighbors who had been fined for everything from mailbox colors to garden decorations began grumbling, clearly realizing they'd been played. "That's enough," one man called from the back. "We've had enough of this nonsense." By the time the meeting ended, Karen's authority was hanging by a thread, and I knew her power trip was about to come crashing down. As I walked home that night, Max greeted me at the door with his tail wagging. I knelt beside him, ruffling his fur. "Looks like you're not a criminal after all," I joked. His tail thumped against the floor, and for once the neighborhood felt calm again. The next HOA meeting couldn't come soon enough. By the time the evening rolled around, I had a folder stuffed with documents, evidence and testimony. I wasn't just planning to dispute my fine, I was going to expose Karen's power trip for the whole neighborhood to see. When I arrived at the community center, the room was already buzzing. More residents than usual had shown up, their faces marked with a mix of curiosity and frustration. Apparently, I wasn't the only one tired of Karen's antics. Karen, predictably, stood at the front of the room like she owned the place. She wore her usual smug smile, clipboard in hand, and her overly crisp blazer, like she believed she was the CEO of some major corporation rather than the head of a suburban HOA. She tapped her pen on the podium, calling the meeting to order. "We'll start by reviewing recent violations," she announced, her gaze locking onto mine. "I understand Mr. Thompson is here to address his." I stood, clutching my folder tightly. "Actually," I said, stepping forward, "I'd like to address more than just my fine." The murmurs started instantly. Karen's smile twitched, but she kept her calm. "Let's stay on topic," she said sweetly. "Oh, we will," I replied, placing my folder on the podium. I turned to face the room. "I've been a homeowner here for years, longer than most of you. I was even part of the founding team that wrote the HOA guidelines." That part hit like a hammer. Karen's expression faltered, just for a second, before she forced her smile back into place. "Recently," I continued, "I received a fine $500 for a so-called noise disturbance from my dog, and a supposed fence violation. But what Karen didn't expect was that I'd remember what the rules actually say." I pulled out a copy of the original HOA charter, and held it up. "This document, the original HOA guidelines, defines noise violations as persistent barking, lasting more than 30 consecutive minutes. Max barely barks for 30 seconds. let alone half an hour. Karen's smile thinned. That rule has been updated, she interrupted. No, it hasn't, I shot back. All policy changes require a 2/3 majority vote, and there's no record of that ever happening. I flipped to the page outlining fence regulations, and my fence, I tapped the paragraph with my finger. Properties bordering communal spaces are allowed a fence up to 6 feet 2 inches tall. My fence is exactly 6 feet 2 inches. The room erupted in murmurs, neighbors whispering to each other in disbelief. Now you could call this an oversight, I continued, but it's not. This isn't the first time Karen's bent the rules to suit herself. In fact, I opened my folder and began distributing printed copies of emails, HOA letters, and testimonials from neighbors. Remember when the Johnsons were fined for their garden decorations? I said. They were well within regulation, but Karen claimed they were an eyesore. The Johnsons, sitting near the back, nodded firmly. And remember when the Williams family got fined for parking their RV in their driveway? I added. They had an approved permit for temporary parking, but Karen issued a fine anyway. The Williams family spoke up. Yeah, she said our paperwork must have been lost in the system. I could keep going, I said, voice rising. Karen's been running this HOA like her personal kingdom, making up rules, ignoring the real ones, and fining anyone who doesn't follow her version of what this neighborhood should look like. The murmurs turned to grumbles. Several people openly scowled in Karen's direction. That's enough, Karen snapped, her voice finally losing its fake sweetness. You're just twisting things to get out of your fine. Twisting things, I laughed dryly. Karen, I'm not twisting anything. I'm just showing everyone what you've been doing behind their backs. You can't just. I can, I interrupted firmly, and I will. In fact, I move that we vote on removing Karen as HOA president. The room went still. Karen's face turned a blotchy shade of red. You can't just call for a vote, she sputtered. Yes, I can, I replied. It's right here in the HOA bylaws. A president can be removed by a majority vote if misconduct is demonstrated. The neighbors began to murmur again, louder this time. Karen's usual aura of control had vanished, replaced by something closer to panic. I second the motion. Dave, one of the quieter board members, spoke from the front row. The tension broke as people around the room started raising their hands. Motion to vote, Dave asked. Standing now, hands shot up. Nearly everyone in the room. Karen's face drained of color. By the time the vote was counted, Karen's reign as HOA president was officially over. She stood frozen behind the podium, staring blankly at the result. This isn't fair, she muttered under her breath. It's exactly fair, I said, gathering my folder. The rules apply to everyone, Karen, even you. In the weeks that followed, our neighborhood felt different, lighter, like someone had opened a window after years of stale air. Dave stepped in as the new HOA president, and to his credit, he prioritized fixing the damage Karen had left behind. Unfair fines were refunded, and the absurd restrictions she'd pushed were scrapped. One morning, as I sat on my porch enjoying my coffee, Dave stopped by. He leaned against the railing, smiling. We owe you for that, he said. You don't owe me anything, I replied. I just reminded everyone what the rules really are. Max, lying contentedly in the yard, let out a bark. Just one short cheerful sound. Better watch it, I joked. That's half a second closer to a noise violation. Dave chuckled. Yeah, not anymore. In the weeks following Karen's removal as HOA president, life in the neighborhood began to feel refreshingly normal again. The tension that had gripped our streets seemed to dissolve, replaced by an easy calm that reminded me of why I'd moved here in the first place. Kids played outside without parents nervously checking to see if their sidewalk chalk drawings would somehow violate HOA rules. Neighbors began chatting freely again, no longer afraid that a casual conversation might be twisted into a complaint. It felt like the community was finally breathing again. One afternoon, as I was working in my garage, I noticed Karen pacing on the sidewalk. She kept glancing at my house, her face twisted with irritation. I wasn't surprised. She hadn't exactly taken her removal well. Rumor had it she'd spent days ranting to anyone who'd listen, claiming she'd been set up, and that the whole neighborhood had turned against her. But her power was gone, and now she was just, well, a neighbor like everyone else. Sure enough, she made a beeline for my driveway.
I hope you're happy, she spat, her arms crossed tightly. You made me look like a fool. I set down my toolbox, wiping my hands on a rag. Karen, you didn't need my help to do that, I said, keeping my tone calm. You broke the rules, the same rules you tried to force on everyone else. I was trying to improve this neighborhood, she shot back. If people would just follow my lead. They did, I cut in, and it led to chaos. People shouldn't have to live in fear of their own HOA. For a moment she just stood there, fuming. This place is going to fall apart without me, she sneered. Don't come crying to me when your improvements ruin everything. With that, she turned and stomped away. I couldn't help but smile as I watched her go. Karen had spent so long pretending to be in charge, that she couldn't stand living in a neighborhood that no longer answered to her. Later that evening, Dave stopped by with a cold drink in hand. Thought you might need this, he said with a grin. I chuckled and accepted the drink. Looks like Karen's still not over it. She'll come around, Dave said. Eventually, we sat in silence for a while, watching Max chase his tail in the yard. The sun dipped low, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood. For the first time in a long time, everything felt right. You know, Dave said thoughtfully, I think this place is finally starting to feel like a community again. Yeah, I agreed, smiling as Max trotted up to me, tongue hanging out. It sure is.